Many people think America escaped from a mad king, a tyrant, a broken mind, a monarch who lost the colonies. George III is often remembered exactly that way. But the real story is not that simple. The American Revolution was not caused by one man going insane. It was not a king waking up and choosing oppression. It was a slower, messier political collapse. Taxes, war debt, imperial fear, and colonial identity all collided. George III did make serious mistakes, but he was not a fairy tale villain. And he did not lose America because he was mad. In fact, the famous breakdown came after the crisis had begun. That is where the misunderstanding starts. Later history compressed a complicated imperial crisis into one image. A mad king lost a continent. The label is powerful. It is also convenient, but it hides the real questions. Why did Britain fail to understand colonial anger? Why did colonists stop trusting London? How much power did George III really have? Did he personally control every policy? Or did the revolution need a clear villain? To understand that, forget the stage version of the Mad King. We need to meet a younger, stubborn, and very sane George. George III was born in 1738. He was not raised as a monster waiting to rule the world. He was serious, religious, cautious, and unusually dutiful. Unlike his grandfather, George II, he was born in Britain. That mattered deeply to his public image. He wanted to be seen as a truly British king, not a foreign ruler imported from Germany. He studied hard and lived more simply than many expected. He disliked corruption, court games, and political factions. Young George believed monarchy carried moral responsibility. That does not sound like the beginning of a tyrant. But he also believed in order. He believed in hierarchy. He believed an empire had to be obeyed. To him, a king was not just decoration. He was not an absolute dictator in the modern sense, but he was not powerless either. British politics in the 18th century was still blurry. Parliament was becoming more important. Cabinets were becoming more important. Yet the crown still had influence. The king could choose ministers. He could encourage policies. He could reward allies and pressure enemies. George III wanted to use those powers, not because he hated liberty, but because he wanted stable royal authority. That desire was already controversial at home. Across the Atlantic, it would become dangerous. When George became king, Britain had just won a massive war. The 7 Years' War defeated France and expanded British North America. On the surface, it looked like glory. Underneath, it left Britain with frightening debt. The government had to pay for armies, fleets, and imperial defense. Many in London thought the colonies should help pay. After all, the war had protected them, but colonists saw it very differently. They believed they had already paid in blood and money. More importantly, they had no representatives in Parliament. A technical tax issue became a question of principle. If London could tax them, where was the limit? If Parliament could take money without consent, what liberty remained? That is why no taxation without representation mattered. It was not just a catchy slogan. It was the awakening of a political identity. George III did not personally invent those taxes. The Stamp Act, Townshend duties, and Tea Act came through government, but the king supported defending parliamentary authority. He did not want the empire to retreat under protest. In his mind, retreat would encourage more resistance. In colonial eyes, that became proof of tyranny. Both sides began using different languages for the same events. London called it order. Boston called it slavery. The king called it law. Colonists called it an attack on rights. Misunderstanding did not explode all at once. It built layer by layer. The Stamp Act of 1765 was the first major eruption. Paper legal documents, newspapers, and licenses were taxed. For colonists, the tax touched ordinary daily life. Protests spread quickly. Crowds attacked tax officials. Merchants organized boycotts. Pamphlets turned anger into political theory. Britain eventually repealed the Stamp Act, but it also declared Parliament could legislate in all cases. So the crisis did not end. It merely changed shape. George III believed imperial authority had to hold. He could not accept colonies obeying laws selectively, but colonists could not accept unconditional obedience. They began to suspect British liberty stopped at the ocean. The later tea tax looked small, but by then it was not really about money. Tea had become a symbol of power. That made the Boston Tea Party explosive. To London, it was crime and disorder. To colonists, it was resistance and principle. Britain answered with the coercive acts. Boston Harbor was closed. Massachusetts' self-government was sharply reduced. The presence of troops made everything more tense. George III supported this harder line. In that sense, he was not a bystander. He was not innocently standing far away. But he was not a madman writing every order himself. What mattered was the failure of an entire political system. Each punishment made empire look more like oppression. Each protest convinced London the colonies were sliding into rebellion. By 1775, the shooting had started. After Lexington and Concord, conflict could not look ordinary anymore. Some people still hoped for reconciliation. Many colonists were not ready to abandon the king. They blamed corrupt ministers and parliament instead. That detail matters. At first, George III was not everyone's enemy. Some colonists still petitioned him. They hoped the king would protect them from parliament. But George refused that role. He saw armed resistance as rebellion. He declared the colonies in open revolt. From that moment, emotional loyalty began to snap. Then Thomas Paine's common sense appeared. It did not merely attack policy, it attacked monarchy itself. Paine made the king central to the problem. That changed the language of the revolution. No longer bad ministers misleading a good king. Now the institution of monarchy itself was rotten. For independence, that was extremely useful. A distant parliament was hard to turn into a monster. A king was much easier. He had a name. He had a face. He could become the container for every grievance. By the Declaration of Independence, that image was complete. The document listed a long series of accusations. Many of them pointed at that he was George III, but historical reality was messier than that language. The Declaration was a political document. It needed to persuade people to break allegiance. So it needed a clear oppressor. George III became that figure. So did he carry responsibility? Yes. He supported hardline policies. He refused to treat colonial protest as legitimate politics. He understood compromise as imperial weakness. He believed rebellion had to be crushed. Once war began, he insisted on continuing it. Even as the cost grew heavier, none of those were small mistakes. But saying madness lost America is something different. George III's most famous mental breakdown came in 1788. That was after the American War had ended. Britain had already recognized American independence. America was not lost during his famous collapse. Popular culture often blurs that timeline. It likes joining Mad King and Lost America together. They sound like the same story. A king loses his mind, then he loses his empire. But the real chronology does not support that version. His later illness was absolutely serious. He endured confusion, suffering, and disturbing medical treatments. The medical explanation has long been debated. Some once suggested porphyria. Others argue mental illness is more likely. Either way, it does not explain the American Revolution. The revolution came from policy, power, and identity, not from a brain suddenly breaking. So why does the Mad King story last? Because it is simple. It gives messy history an easy face. For American memory, it strengthens the founding drama. Colonists were not resisting a complicated system. They were escaping an unstable tyrant. For drama and popular culture, that is easier to tell. A tragic king is more visual than fiscal policy. A mad monarch travels faster than a parliamentary dispute, but simple stories steal complicated truths. George III was not the only enemy of American liberty. He was not an innocent prisoner of the system either. He stood at the center of a changing empire. He tried to hold authority together. He underestimated the colonies' changing political identity. He misjudged what punishment would do. He believed obedience could restore order. Instead, every hard line created more resistance. That was not madness. It was stubbornness, fear, and imperial thinking. And that makes the story more important, not less. History's most dangerous mistakes are not always made by madmen. They are made by normal people convinced they are preserving order. George III lost America, but he did not lose it alone. He became the symbol of a larger failure. An empire could not hear its edges. A political system could not recognize a new identity. A king could not understand loyalty turning into suspicion. So the real question is not whether he was mad. It is why sane people can still fail to see disaster.